Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched The Dead Don't Die from 2019. This is a movie that I can't remember where I heard about it the first time, but it just scrolled across my feed at some point in the last couple of days. And I was like, oh yeah, I should go check that out. That's on my list. And I... Okay, let's talk first about the director, Jim Jarmusch. I don't really know much about him. Turns out I've only seen one of his films before, which is Ghost Dog: The Way of the Samurai, which, if you haven't seen that, and I can almost guarantee you haven't because nobody's seen that movie, it's a very weird film that I am not sure how I feel about. It's interesting, it's unique, and there's no denying that. Generally speaking, I tend to be on the side of I'd rather watch something that's strange and I don't understand and I don't think I particularly like it than something that just bores me. So I was a little hopeful going into this, that include, as well as there's one other movie on my sort of to watch list of his that I may watch in the future. I was sort of hopeful that this would turn out to be something interesting. On its face, it shows itself to be, or it projects itself as a zombie comedy. That's what the marketing looked like. That's what the cast seems to suggest right off the bat. And I don't think that's incorrect. But there's going to be a lot of unpacking in this episode, because this is a movie that has a lot of layers. However, I'm not really ultimately sure how I feel about them. There's both a lot and not a lot going on in this film at the same time, in the sense that it is very simple on its surface and is doing a lot under the surface, but what it actually delivers in all of that doing is a little bit more questionable. If that doesn't make a lot of sense yet, hopefully it will by the end of this video. So the setup is pretty simple. It's a couple of police officers in a small town are sort of, they're patrolling their small town, and that's kind of the whole setup. The two main-ish characters being Bill Murray and Adam Driver, and I'm going to say that they are at the core of the film, sort of very intentionally the leads. There are a bunch of secondary characters and tertiary characters who are not that far off in terms of their, I hesitate to say importance, but their direct relevance to the plot. It's sort of an ensemble piece in a sense, but those two are really sort of the heart of the film in a lot of ways. There is some subversion of that, but we'll get to that in a bit. What you get, okay, I don't even want to talk about what you get in the plot. I think I'm going to just have sort of an explosive bit in the second portion of this video, where I just talk about everything that's going on in the plot. So let's talk about the production first. This has a pretty star-studded cast. I think that's very obvious. It is a long list of very well-known names. Not all of them for being like total A-list actors, but there's certainly quite a few of those as well. There's a lot of B-listers. There's a lot of people who are sort of ancillary, famous in other ways. Either they're singers, models, musical artists, these other things. And that on its face is not necessarily, as I've mentioned before, a good thing or a bad thing. I'll get into talking about later why that is of both an interesting and a very odd choice when we talk about the themes within the film. I know I'm asking you to like keep a lot of these things in your head for later, but I promise it will make sense. I think all of the performances are about what I expect out of these various actors. I think they all put on good performances on par with my expectations for them, and there are a few standout performances that I think are not like amazing, but worthy of note. I think in particular, Adam Driver is excellent in his role, delivers a nicely nuanced performance. I hesitate to say I feel kind of the same about Tilda Swinton, but Tilda Swinton is kind of extraordinary in everything. But I'm biased on that one. Anyway, so the production. This is an inexpensive looking film. And I think that's... God, how do I get into this? Okay, it was allegedly made for about $15 million. It didn't perform particularly well at the box office. I don't think it was ever expected to. I don't know. I actually don't know if it went to how fast it went to digital, but it was the mid 2019, so it should have had some kind of run in theaters. But I don't think it did particularly well. This movie looks cheaper than it is. And I'm going to go ahead and guess that a very substantial chunk of that budget went to the actors that they cast. Oh, I'm sorry. I have this in front of me. I'm looking at the wrong thing. Apparently it performed to the tune of $20 million or $15 million. Allegedly about $2 to $3 million is what it costs to make. So that makes a little bit more sense, actually. Recalculating that in my mind. Okay, that makes more sense because to my mind, I mean, Jim Jarmusch has been around making films for like 30, 40 years now. He's been around for a while. He's been, in a niche of his own. But as I understand it, a decent chunk of the people who are in this film have either been in his films before. I think Tilda Swinton is in a bunch of them, or are otherwise sort of like friends of the family, so to speak, which makes sense. You don't cast a dozen big names in a low budget film for no reason. And so if you can get them on the cheap and you can make the movie on the cheap, then, it's a different kind of thing. Still keep a pin in that because we're going to come back to the casting. So the performances are pretty good. Production wise, it's real rough in some spots. It kind of runs the gamut. Some scenes are most scenes are totally serviceable. Most shots are totally serviceable. There are a few shots that I actually think are really very excellent. The cinematography is very good in a few of those. And there's others that are like genuinely atrocious, like on the level of like student film type of stuff. In particular, there's one scene, I think there's more than one scene that does day for night, but there's one scene in particular where it's like, this is glaringly day for night, and it looks terrible. It looks just awful. We're going to put a pin in that because I'm not sure that was, that may have been on purpose, but we'll get back to that as well. And then there's some other things that are just unpleasant. Some of the audio mixing is really, really poor. And in fairness, no, I think it was actually that poor. I was going to say that the streaming service, that Netflix was probably just doing an absolute terrible job of delivering me the stream because I was trying to watch it. It refused to play at an HD resolution. God knows why. But yeah. So I was gonna say it could have been a streaming compression issue as well, but I'm not. I'm gonna say it's probably also the movie that didn't help though. And as far as, a lot of the other production value stuff, I think it's totally serviceable. I also think there's actually a few sets and things that are actually done extremely well, especially now that I know it's about 2-3 million. That's they actually did a lot with that money under the circumstances. So, could have looked worse. It's just, especially when it's the music playing in your ears or something like that, that's really poorly mixed. It's very glaring when there's an error like that. And I just like actively wanted to I did turn down my speakers, didn't want to turn them down. So yeah, not great on some of the production elements, but pretty good on others. As far as the overall film and the sum of its parts, this is where we're going to get into the nitty-gritty. This is a film that I think is a lot less than the sum of its parts. I actually think as an overall film, it's pretty poor. But there are a bunch of things in it that I like, or at least think are interesting, that make me think it's a worthy watch. So in a minute here, I'm going to get more into talking about, freely talking about elements of the plot. I don't think there's a whole lot to spoil, and you can still watch this even if you listen to me talk about it. But if you are interested in seeing sort of the production elements and some of the writing and some of the performances that I think are pretty all right, then go ahead from here. But at this point, I'm going to start talking about the plot. The plot is really thin. It's basically not relevant at any point. The plot is that these police officers in the small town are confronted with an unknown, confusing from the source of they don't understand the source, but it's the moon or something, causing zombies to rise from the dead. And there's a sense of, there's a lackadaisical nature to their entire approach that is pretty amusing on its face, or at least it should be. Because if there's one thing this movie does, and it does it to a fault, it's subversion. Now, this has become sort of a dirty word in recent years because a lot of movies regularly use subversion in bad ways to try and, subvert your expectations and surprise you, because we're at a point where in cinematic culture in particular, there is such a knowledge of the tropes that have been used over the last 50, 100, 150 years of writing and cinematic performance, that it's a little too easy to know what's going to happen in an entire film because the story is, a variation of another one, or you've seen all the tropes before. You don't have to be, a big movie buff to kind of guess what's happening in a lot of films these days. And so subversion has become sort of dirty because there's a lot of movie makers who use it kind of very slapdash to, be the hook to make their movie stand out. This movie is all subversion all the time. And that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So I'm going to try not to get into tons of individual individual scenarios in which subversion is used, because that's literally, I just talk through the entire film. But I think it's important for what that ends up doing to the film, which is that it makes it boring. And it's hard to tell whether this is intentional or not. I have to assume that it's intentional, that that so many things that are bad about this film are intentional. They have to be. Because if they aren't, then the movie's just terrible. Now, don't get me wrong, it can be both. Technically, you can do things intentionally poorly and still turn something out that's still bad, even though you did it on purpose. I've talked about this many times before, that lampshading a problem does not fix the problem. You can't lampshade something and then just do it anyway and pretend like it isn't an issue. If you, and possibly the most obvious case in which this is happening in the film is that pretty much every element of character development is directly subverted, like in the same scene that it's attempting to happen in the first place. Sometimes even in the same sentence. And so what you get as a result is ultimately a whole bunch of characters with no character development. Now you can tell me, oh, well, we were just subverting your expectations of, the tropes of growth patterns or success or failure patterns of characters in a horror movie or a zombie movie. But that doesn't change the fact that you aren't invested in the characters, that they aren't interesting, that they don't have depth, that they don't have growth, that you already know what they're going to do, or if you don't, that when they do the thing that they do, you're bored or annoyed or upset with them for it because they are actively a bad character. So this stretches far and wide throughout the film, where the initial bit of the film was really hooking me, where my thought process was, okay, we're getting a subversion of the zombie or horror genre, where they're playing all of these tropes of these existing genres, and they're showing them to us, and then they're immediately being subversive because, well, some of the very initial humor is in that way directly subversive, to try and sort of, to my interpretation when I was watching it at that time, I thought it was the setup. I thought it was basically saying, this isn't going to be your typical, comedy horror, comedy zombie movie. We're doing a satire or some such thing. But then it just keeps going and going and going, and it goes in every element. At the same time, there's some other weird things, like a distinct and obvious set of fourth wall breaks from one character in particular that then only gets played. It gets played on a couple of times, but with no actual progress in that sort of arc, where you're going, that's an obvious fourth wall break that's very deliberate. It's being flagged for us to look at, but then it's not doing anything. And they do one final point at it at the end of the film, and it's for a joke that then also falls flat because it's subverted. So it's a subversion of a subversion. And so that got me starting to think about a whole other set of layers here. Like I said before, keep this in your mind, lampshading a problem doesn't fix the problem. So if you made a boring movie, even if you made it boring on purpose, it's still boring. But this started me thinking on some of the commentary elements of the film. one of the very overt social commentary throughout this film that is also one of the first things I was thinking about in terms of its complete lack of subtlety is about how the zombies are a very, like, literally beat you in the head with it kind of commentary on rampant consumerism, mindless consumerism. This is nothing new for the zombie genre. It's been done many, many times before, including in several movies I've talked about on this show. So it was nothing new to see there. But it's done with such ham-fistedness that my thought was, okay, so it's doing it badly on purpose, right? Because it's not actually saying anything. It doesn't go beyond the surface level. It's just like, it's literally zombies staring at their phones and saying Siri or things like that. And it's like, okay, but that's so overt. It's not actually funny. It's not actually a commentary because it's so surface level that it's like your eyes glaze over. There's also like a political commentary in here, one particular character who is an overt political commentary, and it's just like, but it's so obvious that can't be the joke, right? That can't be it. And then as I was sort of reflecting on the film as a whole towards, after I had finished it, that got me thinking about the cast again. And this is where it started to click for me a little bit. And I think I get it, but it doesn't fix it. And I think that ultimately it's this layered commentary about how the movie itself is disappointing because it doesn't do any of the things that you want a movie to do. The characters aren't interesting. The story isn't interesting. The commentary behind it is dull and, uninventive, uninteresting. What was the name of that movie? Don't Look Up. It's like it's doing that, but even with even less subtlety, and it's doing it ironically, right? Because it can't be worse than Don't Look Up. It's doing these tropes of the zombie and horror genres there, where even on the fourth wall breaks, or not necessarily the fourth wall breaks, but the awareness of the characters, where these characters know zombie fiction in a movie about zombies, which is kind of a rarity. I think the only one I can think of off the top of my head, it's actually another one we watched on the show, which was One Cut of the Dead, and maybe Shaun of the. I don't remember if Shaun of the Dead acknowledges or not overtly that it. I think it does. I think it does overtly acknowledge, like, oh, this is a zombie scenario. We've seen this before. So yeah, and those are both much better zombie films that also subvert their genre extremely well. So having them as comparisons is even worse news for this movie. And then it's back to the cast. Is the fact that even in the marketing, it's very, very overt that, hey, we've got a dozen extremely big names on this film that's like this indie, semi-indie, zombie comedy. Like, clearly we must be doing something crazy with this. Like, if you don't know who Jim Jarmusch is, or really anything about, I don't really know anything about Jim Jarmusch other than the one movie I've watched of his, but like, you still don't really know what you're necessarily going to get. But when all of the marketing seems to unironically be saying our marketing is about our star-studded cast, and then you get into the movie and that's all ultimately subverted because none of the characters are particularly fleshed out, and then also they all have very minor roles, And like, is that then also another layer of commentary on all of this of like, oh, this is our meta nature. You are the zombies, and your consumerism is what drove you to watch this movie in the first place because of our star-studded cast of characters that you watched because they are a star-studded cast of characters. And that's all fine, but it doesn't make a good movie. So then, like, how far do you have to zoom out from this movie to make it valuable? Like, I've watched some very strange movies in the past, and this is a whole other level of like how much favor do I have to give to this movie before I can validate it being good for a reason that isn't the movie itself, you know? Because it's not a good movie, like I've talked about. Like, it's got some good elements in it, but am I hunting for an answer that isn't there, or am I giving credit where none should be due because I'm applying something to it that wasn't actually the intention? Am I trying to find a meaning in a movie that's actually just bad? Like, I don't know. Like, that's the existential crisis of the viewer of a piece of art. Or was that the intention all along? I'd like to believe that Jim Jarmusch has been in the industry long enough and has enough artistically talented friends that just crapping out a bad movie that's overtly bad can't be the point. That at some level this has to be a kind of immersive art piece, that where you as the viewer are part of the failure and it's on purpose. But that still doesn't make it a good film. It's interesting as like a philosophical thought piece to reflect on it after, but it's still not a good film. And maybe I am, like I said, maybe I'm just hunting for a value or a meaning or an artistic depth that is absolutely not there, and I've concocted completely out of my own brain. Who knows? Anyway, I think I'm going to go lie down because I was having a weird enough time thinking about this movie before, and now I'm like dropping into an existential crisis full blown. This movie's very strange. I guess I'm not going to tell you don't watch it because it's kind of fine, but it doesn't make for a very good cinematic experience. Anyway, I've been the Social Solipsist. I'll see you guys next time.